this is Dr. Stan here at Radio Liberty, coming to you from the hills overlooking beautiful and picturesque Monterey Bay, and bringing you the news behind the news, the story behind the story. Hoping to convince you that reality is usually scoffed at and that illusion is usually king. But in the battle for the survival of Christian civilization, it's going to be reality and not illusion or delusion that will determine what the future will bring. And I need to remind you the views expressed here are not necessarily those of the owners, management, staff, sponsors, or supporters of the station you're listening to. They happen to be my views, and well, for the next hour, they're going to be the views of Harry Cooper, and we're going to be talking about his book on Adolf Hitler. Hi, Harry, how are you tonight?
Very good, sir. Thank you.
Well, I appreciate so much for being with us, and you're with Shark Hunters. Is that the title of your organization?
Yeah, that's correct. We started 31 years ago, and our primary focus was the history of the German U-boats. And back in those days, we thought it was a clever title because submarines are like sharks, and we hunt their history.
All right, fine. Well, of course, German, the U-boats are important, but they're also very important to the story of the escape of Adolf Hitler. And the fact that most Americans have been conditioned to believe that Adolf Hitler died in a bunker in Berlin at the end of the war. But you have a different story, and that's why I want you to come on tonight, tell our listeners the background of the story that you were told by somebody who already came from the Nazi point of view. Will you go ahead and pick up the story, and we'll go from there.
Okay. It began in 1985. We had a new member by the name of Don Angel Alcazar de Velasco, who was a Spaniard, of course, with a name like that, and he was an intelligence agent throughout the war, working for Germany, and for about 3 months before the end of the war, he was in the bunker itself. And he sent me a letter. It was typewritten, single-spaced, 114 pages long, telling me about this entire incident. And he saw Hitler and Eva Braun forcibly drugged under orders of Martin Bormann and removed from the bunker. Bormann, of course, was the power behind the throne, more or less. Toward the end of the war, he had pretty well usurped power. Goering was a discredited buffoon, and Himmler and those guys were pretty much pushed on the outside. And so Bormann wanted to keep the Reich alive, and he needed a figurehead. And so Don Angel saw Hitler and Eva Braun forcibly drugged and removed from the bunker. And years later, as I say, Shark Hunters began in 1983. We've just had our 31st anniversary, started our 32nd year. And one of our members was a guy named Bob Thew, T-H-E-W, retired United States Navy captain, and he had spent his entire naval career in naval intelligence. And after he retired, he went into the NSA and finally retired from that. So he was visiting, I think it was 1985, 86, right after I had gotten the letter from Don Angel. And I asked if he had ever heard of a Spanish spy by the name Don Angel Alcazar de Velasco, and he started to chuckle. And I said, "What's so funny?" He says, "Yeah, he was a German spy, we know that, but he was just not a very good spy because everybody knew he was a spy." And so I believed what I was taught in school. And so I said, "Bob, this guy must be nuts." He sent me a letter and said that he rode a submarine with Martin Bormann down to South America, and that he claimed Hitler didn't die in the bunker. I said, "Everybody knows he committed suicide." And just as calm as if he was asking for another cup of tea, Bob said, "No, he didn't." I said, "What do you mean, no, he didn't?" He said, "We knew Hitler didn't die in the bunker." So I said, "Okay, who's we?" And he said, "The intel community."
Hold that thought. We'll be back in a moment.
Very well.
Well, Harry, you picked the story up there, and so you're talking to this fellow who's with naval intelligence, and he said the entire naval intelligence community knew Hitler didn't buy in the bunker, and you probably just about, you probably found it almost impossible to believe, as I did when I first heard that, because, I mean, after all, our reality is created by the things we read, and if everybody agrees, but then suddenly this idea that maybe Hitler didn't die, and then, of course, as you pick up the story. Anyway, the fellow from naval intelligence tells you that he didn't die.
Right.
So what do you do at this point?
Well, at that point, I started following the story a little more closely, and he indicated, Don Angel indicated in this 114-page long letter that Gross Admiral Karl Dönitz was in the Führerbunker in late April of 1945, and I thought this would not be possible because I thought Berlin was totally ringed by the Red Army. So I contacted Captain Ali Kramer, Peter Erich Kramer, who was commander of U-333, but at the end of the war he was in command of the security detail around Gross Admiral Dönitz. And he came back to me and said, no, it was not possible for Admiral Dönitz to be in Berlin because it was ringed by the Red Army. So I figured, okay, Don Angel's a liar, and I just put his letter away and went back to, history of the U-boats. And I got a phone call a week later from Captain Kramer. He had consulted his personal diary and indicated that, yes, Grand Admiral Dönitz was in the Führerbunker over the 20th of April, which was Hitler's birthday. And so he obviously had been telling the truth. So we continued to research, and it's only been in the last few years that it's really gotten intense. And since about 2008, we've just peeled back the layers of onion skin here. I've been to Argentina 4 times. Every time, of course, I'd spent a week in Buenos Aires speaking to people. And 2 times I was in Bariloche and visited the estate where Hitler lived. And 2 times I was in Cordova, which is the area he went after 1955, because in 1955, Bariloche had been discovered as a tourist attraction.
Well, this is Dr. Stan, and certainly Harry is saying that basically there were certain things that initially made it appear that the story wasn't true, but of course, as the people he had talked to investigated, everything pointed to the fact that it really was true, that Hitler had actually been taken from the bunker and had actually gone to South America. Well, of course, and then, of course, Harry has been to South America on 4 times, actually, and he's been at least on several occasions, to the actual place where Hitler stayed for so many years when he was living in South America, living there in Argentina and Patagonia. But go ahead with the story. You tell it, Harry, because you've lived this, you've investigated, you've been to the areas, you've talked to the people. Do the people there in Patagonia, do some of the Spanish people know that Adolf Hitler was living there and escaped to South America?
You bet they did. When I was there first time in 2008, my 2 Argentine friends and I went to the... well, first off, you have to understand, San Carlos de Bariloche, little town at the foothills of the Andes, if you were blindfolded and dropped off there, you'd think you were in Bavaria. So we went to this very nice restaurant for dinner, and the owner met us at the door. He was about 75 or 80 years old, very tall, blue eyes, blonde hair, not your typical gaucho. And he didn't speak English. I don't speak Spanish. He was explaining the specials to my friends in Spanish. They were giving them to me in English, and it wasn't working. So just for the heck of it, I said, bitte mein Herr, ich möchte eine Speisekarte mit English schreiben. Please, sir, I'd like an English menu. Bingo, like that. Oh, mein Freund, haben Sie nicht? And we talked for about 2 minutes in German, and then I asked, I asked him in German, you speak good German, why? Oh, I'm Swiss. Okay, sure you are. And so he was providing some music during the evening. His friend was playing a guitar. He was playing what's called a chiffle-clavier, which is like an accordion, but with buttons on both sides. And I asked him if he could play the Matrosen Lied, the song that the U-boaters always sang when they were going out to battle. No, don't know that one. Okay, so I was back eating some really excellent Argentine beef, and suddenly we hear, "Heute wollen wir ein Liedlein singen," and he went through the entire Matrosen Lied, and then through the entire Panzer Lied, the song of the armored division, and he got done and smiled at me, and I gave him a thumbs up, and he stood up, clicked his heels, and stuck his right arm out in the air. There were a lot of SS officers in that town, including a guy named Erich Priebke, who just died, 5-6 months ago, I guess. He was the headmaster of the German school in this little town. He was also the head of the German Historical Society. And in 1995, Sam Donaldson, the guy with the fiberglass wig, went down there and more or less outed him.
And basically, ladies and gentlemen, Sam Donaldson, I think I've forgotten whether he worked for CBS, but he worked for one of the major networks.
Right.
And there's actually, he made a DVD, he went down there, and he actually made a program, and I forgot, was that a 20 minutes, 60 minutes? I've forgotten what it was, but he actually went down and he talked to a lot of the Nazis there, and he talked about how Adolf Hitler had escaped. But basically, of course, the last thing they wanted was for the American people to know that. Now, the Donaldson go into Hitler's escape, or was it primarily just about the Nazis who escaped to South America under the rat line?
It was primarily the guys who escaped on the rat line.
Yeah, I think I stand corrected. He did not cover Hitler's escape because, of course, that never would have been allowed on television in the United States.
Sure.
Oh, but of course, though, because you see, the people who control the television outlets here are part and parcel of what I call the Brotherhood. And the last thing they want you to know, first of all, I was surprised they put out the fact that tens of thousands of Nazi war criminals escaped to South America with the full help and support of our intelligence agencies. And to Sam Donaldson's credit, he did bring that out. But the last thing they want you to know is our intelligence agencies also knew Hitler had escaped and did absolutely nothing to apprehend him and allowed him to live out his life comfortably. This arch criminal, but you go right ahead. Anyway, you were just talking about suddenly how Sam Donaldson had gone to this community and had actually outed this gentleman who passed away recently. Go ahead.
Right, and the thing that makes our research so much easier and wide-ranging is the fact that we have a huge membership. We're almost up to 8,000 members, minus those who have died and a few idiots I've thrown out. And some of them are researchers also. And we have what we call SEIG agents, S-E-I-G, Shark Hunters, Eagle Hunters Intelligence Group. Some of them are retired spooks. Some of them are active duty spooks from the CIA, the FBI, Dutch intelligence. And one of them lives close to the National Archives. And he spent a lot of time in the National Archives digging out files that were stuck in dusty old boxes that some of the archivists didn't even know were there. And we have hundreds of files from the FBI and the CIA that state flat out they knew Hitler was in Argentina. They knew he got away, and these are from 1945 on up to 1960. So our government knew it, our intel knew it, our spooks knew it, but you and I are not supposed to know it.
And of course, that was confirmed by our good friend, certainly Dr. Jerome Corsi, who was able to track down some of those files going there. And basically, of course, they had the file for Adolf Hitler's escape. Certainly not under Adolf Hitler. It was listed under a U-boat. In fact, the U-boat that carried him there, that's where the file was. It was actually being hidden, because the last thing they wanted for people to find it, we've talked to Gerard Williams, one of the two authors of a book called Grey Wolf, published in, it's actually, we carry the book, and that goes also into that escape of Adolf Hitler. And basically, we've talked to Mr. Williams. In fact, we talked to him just this last week. We have an interview with him. You must understand, ladies and gentlemen, that the information is there, but the last thing they want is for the American people to find out, because they've been able to convince us that Adolf Hitler died, and then we suddenly realize that we've been lied to, and the most of what we believe are lies. The American people might actually begin to wake up and realize the implications of what this is really all about, and how our government worked closely with the Nazis all during World War II. Just as today we're working with both the communist Russians and communist Chinese in preparation for a coming war with the communist world. But that's another story. Let's get back to what you have found. So basically you have a gentleman friend of yours who actually had found the archives, and you actually have copies of some of these reports?
Yeah, we do. And we couldn't put them all into our new book, which is Hitler in Argentina. And if your listeners go to sharkhunters.com, they'll be able to read about that and our monthly magazine, etc.
Now, is that book actually out at the present time?
No, we don't have it listed on. We don't have it ready yet. It's about 2 weeks away from getting it here in stock. It would have been done by now, except the publishing house kept screwing around with the cover. Oh, it's a little too red. Oh, this word is a little too much over here. And finally I told them, quit screwing around, or we'll go print it somewhere else. So we should have the proofing copy in hand by the end of this week, and then we'll just tell them it's clear, let's go, and we'll get a stock in here.
Well, we will want to carry it as well. So we have a story we want to get out. So you go right ahead. But anyway, you actually include copies of many of these archives in your book. Go right ahead.
Yeah, not only the files, but also photos of important places, and also the background of a lot of other people that were in Argentina. Some we knew about, like Mengele, Eichmann. What we're not told is Eichmann was a poor man. He didn't have any money, which is what made him easy to be caught. And he worked in various factories, one after another, and finally he was working at the Mercedes-Benz factory, which was a 3-hour bus ride out and 3 hours home. And he lived in a little house that he and his sons had built by hand. It was only about 20 feet by 20 feet. It was nothing more than a shack in a very, very rough neighborhood. And that's what made it easy for the Mossad to grab him. We talked to his tailor, an old man named Francisco. And Francisco's children played with Eichmann's 2 sons. And the younger of the 2 Eichmann sons frequently said that they had lived in the Vatican for some time after the war, and that they had met with the Pope a few times.
And because basically what people find it hard to believe is the Vatican was actually working with the Nazis as well. But because, of course, it's all about world government and world religion. But go right ahead.
Okay. So he was easy to be grabbed. Others, like Mengele, had a ton of money, and Mengele and a guy named Ante Pavlik, who was the Croatian strongman, even after the Germans surrendered, he kept telling his people to fight on until finally, it was useless. He came to Argentina. He was a poor man. He was a bricklayer. But then through a friend of his, he met Juan Perón, and suddenly he owned a big construction company, and he built some of the skyscrapers that are in Buenos Aires still today, and he was a very wealthy man. And one evening, he got off the bus on the corner by his house, and a Yugoslavian secret police guy was standing there waiting for him and shot him twice in the back. He didn't die, but he died 2 years later in the hospital. There were so many that went there, and they stopped off all the way from 1940, well, up until 1947. They had the Rat Line, as you know it, going south, and the way had been laid
hold that thought. That's the Rat Line, R-A-T line.
Yep.
Okay, go right ahead, Harry. Anyway, Chris, so as many of the Nazis escaped to South America. Go right ahead with your story.
Very well. They'd come out of a little town called Villa Garcia, which is up the river from the town or the city of Vigo in Spain. And if you ever saw the movie Das Boot, you remember the scene where there was a German freighter in the harbor in Vigo, and the U-boats would come up and pick up fresh supplies, and they could take showers, etc. That did happen. The Charlotte Schliemann was there, and various other German surface ships were there during the war. After the war, like I say, they came out of Villa Garcia and went down to a little area in Caleta de los Loros, which is Parrot Cove, at the northwestern corner of Golfo San Matia. My Spanish pronunciation is horrible, I know. And all during the war, they had been running in and out with black boats, we call them, submarines that didn't exist on paper. And also there was a guy named Heinrich Garbers, Kapitänleutnant. Nobody ever heard of him. He won the Knight's Cross, but he never got into combat. He won his Knight's Cross because he was sneaking in and out of Argentina in a two-masted sailing vessel, yawl-rigged, and he told Bormann that it was easy to get in and out with a wooden boat because radar wasn't picking him up. So they decided, okay, that Dönitz was overheard to say, we have found a Shangri-La for the Führer. And so on this route south, about 1,000 kilometers east of Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, there's a little island nobody ever heard of called Trindade, not to be confused with Trinidad. And the island is about 2.5 miles long by 1.5 miles wide, and it goes up to 3,000 feet. So everything on this island is up and down hills. And they had fresh water there, lots of streams and creeks. And they also, during the war years, they had herds of pigs and herds of goats. And as I say, I don't just read about these places. I went to this island. You can only go there with the permission and the assistance of the Brazilian Navy. And they were just incredibly great. They not only gave me permission, they gave me a ride out there on one of their ships. I was on the island for 3 days. One of our agents, as I call them, in Germany, had sent me photos of this island taken in 1939 when Brazil pulled its people off the island. They normally keep 2 dozen or so sailors on the island to raise the flag and lower it at night and say, we own 200 miles of fishing around here. 1939, they pulled their people off the island, and the Germans had a scientific task force waiting almost offshore because they were there within a week. They built 2 80-meter-high radio towers, and I was on the location of those 2 different radio towers. One of them is totally gone because of rains and things washed away. The other one, the ruins of the building is there. A little building about 10 foot by 10 foot.
Hold that thought. We'll be back here in just a moment.
Yes, sir.
Well, this is Dr. Stan. Our guest is Harry Cooper. A fascinating interview. Harry's just telling us about an island about a couple of 100 miles off the shore, east shore of Brazil, basically out in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. Basically, which the Brazilians turned over to the Nazis about 1939. So the Nazis then could utilize that. Well, did they use that to help with their submarines or what?
Mostly to replenish food and fresh water
for the submarines.
South.
Okay.
Submarines, etc.
What about Adolf Hitler, though? Because that's the thing that I think most people are interested in. Certainly, they were using this island to replenish the food and water for the submarines. But where does Hitler fit into this? And when, of course, did he arrive? So did he go directly to South America, directly into Argentina, and then directly to this beautiful estate where he lived so much of the rest of his life? But you pick the story up, because I think people are interested in Hitler. What happened to Hitler? Because that is, of course, the most carefully kept secret in America today, and the last thing that the Brotherhood wants the public to know about. Go ahead.
Yeah, that's for sure. One last thought about this island. The Germans left it in 1941. The Brazilians came back, but then the war ended. The Brazilians left, and the Germans came until 2 years after the war, 1947, to replenish everything going south on the rat line. Now, Hitler, we are quite certain, came ashore, I think it was Bahia Blanco, and this would be in the dead of winter down there. July, August is the dead of winter. And there's a rail line heading west from the little town there in Caleta de los Loros, and it went out to a place called Estancia San Ramon Ranch. And
now, is this in Argentina? Where is it?
Yes, this is in Patagonia.
Okay, fine. Go ahead.
And we believe they stayed there for the winter because Bariloche is another 30, 40 miles west, and there was no train going the rest of the way. And dead of winter, they had to wait until it was the snow was gone before they could go to their estate in Nalca, which was built by Mercedes money, allegedly. And so I went there in 2008, and we spoke to the manager of the ranch, a young man, maybe 40-ish, spoke excellent English with a German accent. He spoke excellent Argentine Spanish with a German accent, and he was very pleasant. He answered all our questions until I got to the one where I asked which one of the guest houses did Hitler and Eva Braun stay in until the spring thaws. Well, you would think the man being 40 years old would just duck out and say, well, that was before my time. I'm only 40. No, I remember it as if it was just 5 minutes ago. He said, I have been instructed I must not speak about that time. So that right there is a red flag.
Sure.
So we've got pictures of the celebrations on Hitler's birthday every year at a place called, I don't know how you pronounce it, LLAO-LLAO. In Spanish, that's pronounced Yao Yao, but in Argentine Spanish, it's Xiao Xiao. It's a very, very plush resort, built in 1938, and they had parties there every year on the 20th of April. And we have a photograph of Dwight Eisenhower at this place in 1960. And you have to ask yourself, what the hell is the American president doing at a place like this, which, remember, was 700 miles southwest of Buenos Aires, and it might as well have been on the dark side of the moon back in those days. I mean, it was incredibly remote, but he was there. Now, as for Hitler himself, they were very careful. We have not been able to uncover a single photo of him. We have found a man who worked for this Ante Pavlik guy that was the Croatian strongman. He worked for him in the construction industry, and he saw Hitler meeting with Ante Pavlik 3 different times in the city of Mar de la Plata, which is today it's a big resort town. It's also a big Argentine Navy base. I've been there. And if your listeners have followed the history much, 2 submarines, U-530 and U-977, surrendered in Mar de la Plata 3 months after the war ended. And you have to, especially U-977, it was a Type 7 submarine that didn't have enough range to get there, but he got there anyhow. And they made a big deal that there was no paperwork of any kind on these two submarines. They'd all jettisoned every scrap of...
Hold that thought. We'll be back in just a moment.
Aye, aye.
Okay, go right ahead, Harry. You were just saying that suddenly the submarines, there were a couple of submarines, one of them didn't have enough suddenly carrying power to get there, but it got there anyway.
Right.
And basically, go right ahead.
Yeah, that was U-977, and he left Norway with three-quarters of a fuel load, went down off England to his combat area. The war ended. He came back to Norway, put ashore the married men, and apparently loaded a lot of items that were going to South America because the engineering officer had a hard time trimming out the boat. But then he made it all the way to South America. He claimed he stretched his mileage by snorkeling 66 days underwater. Well, that makes no sense at all. You have to run the diesel anyhow, and if you're pushing the conning tower and all the rest of that stuff through the water, you've got a lot of extra parasite drag, so that's baloney. But when they got there, they had no paperwork on board at all. Baloney. One of our members, who's a good friend of mine, was a German agent, and he was sent down to Argentina 2 years after the end of the war to translate all the paperwork that was not on the boat. And when I was there in 2008 in Mar de la Plata, they hauled out two big transfer boxes full of paperwork and told me I could look through it if I liked. So I can't read German very well at all, and this is the old German, so I didn't even try. But the point is, there's double stories there. There was no paperwork on board except here's the paperwork. So we're not sure which boat Hitler came down on. We're not sure which boat Martin Bormann came on, but we know without a doubt they did. And as I say, it's in my book. And incidentally, if your listeners would like, they can send an email, sharkhunters@earthlink.net, and just say they'd like a free copy of our monthly magazine, and I'll bop it back to them by email. One of the questions we're asked quite frequently... Hold
that thought. We'll be back here in just a moment. We bring our stations on board. Well, this is Dr. Stan, and basically, of course, Harry Cooper is just talking suddenly with the fact that they tracked the submarines. They're not sure which submarine Hitler was on, but suddenly there were several submarines that actually suddenly turned themselves in over to the Argentine government. Hitler was probably already on one, Martin Bormann, but they'd gotten off. And suddenly, what was the name of his book? Oh, somebody wants to know the name of the book. It's Hitler in Argentina. But you go right ahead.
Okay, very well. And, boy, I was listening to your music there, and I lost my train of thought.
Well, basically, of course, we're trying to find out. Hitler got to Argentina. Do we have any idea about what time of year he got there? Was it been June or July? And then, of course, I think he spent the winter there, suddenly some distance away from there. And then was actually the estate built? Was it ready for him when the spring came, or what?
Yeah, apparently so. We do have some FBI files that name the farm or the ranch, whatever it was, that he was hiding on in Spain right after the war, and then he went down to Argentina. Now, there were so many people at the end of the war, I mean high-ranking people, who knew he got away. Stalin was publicly screaming that England and the United States were not doing enough to find Hitler. This was in July of 45. Well, if the man committed suicide in April and you got the body, why are you looking for him? General Beadle Smith, who was Eisenhower's aide-de-camp adjutant, he flat out said Hitler got away. They all knew it. And that's in my book. And a lot of the naysayers, I got an email this morning from a guy who said he was born 25 years after the war was over, and he read in the newspaper that Hitler committed suicide in the bunker, so I might as well just give up on this notion of Hitler's escape because the newspaper said he committed suicide, and of course they can't print it if it isn't true. Guy must read the National Enquirer. questions I'm always asked is, why didn't they go after him? And so I counter, I ask, well, who is they? Well, they said, why didn't Israel go after him? Well, there was no such place as Israel in 1945. Israel didn't come into being until 1948, and at that point in time, it was just a tiny little country trying to stay alive. Well, then the next question is, why didn't the Mossad go after him? Well, same thing. If there was no Israel, there wasn't much of a Mossad. Plus the fact that Juan Perón in 1945 was a colonel without any land at all and with very little money. And in 1947, he was a general, had a fortune, and bought his way to the presidency of Argentina. He and Martin Bormann had several accounts together, and he lived in the Plaza Hotel for 2 years after the war ended with, we understand, 2 young women. So I went into the Plaza Hotel, which is a gorgeous, gorgeous upscale hotel, and I went to this lady at the desk. She was probably middle-aged. I introduced myself, explained what I was doing, and I said, I'm quite certain that Martin Bormann lived in this hotel for some time after the war. Without batting an eye, this lady says, oh, yeah, room 740, the presidential suite. I said, you knew it? She says, yeah, everybody here knows that.
And basically, there's a book on Martin Bormann, written by a fellow named Palmer, Michael Palmer, who is I think he worked for CBS, or one of the major television networks, and his book on Martin Bormann certainly is a classic on this, and I've read it. But this is the sort of thing that people are not supposed to know. They're supposed to think that Martin Bormann and all these other Nazis that died, and of course, anybody who wants to know certainly why the Jews didn't go after Adolf Hitler needs to get our 4 CD set. It's interviews with John Loftus, who had an opportunity to work for American intelligence for years, and basically he will tell you why the Jews did not go after the Nazis. They were actually given an option. They could either have Israel or they could go after the Nazis, but they couldn't have both. And if they wanted the votes of the countries in South America, to establish the state of Israel, then they'd leave the German war criminals alone, and the Israelis chose to have a nation rather than to go after the Nazis. And basically, Dr. Cuddy's covered this, John Loftus has covered this. We have a number of sources. I think it's probably a valid explanation, or as good as any. But let's go ahead. Basically, you went to this hotel where Martin Bormann had actually stayed. Everybody there had known Martin Bormann was there.
Right.
And then what about, Sunday, did you ever go to the estate where Adolf Hitler lived, and what did you find when you were there?
All right, let me shift gears for a second. I knew John Loftus. He was a member of Shark Hunters many, many years ago, and sometime in the mid-'80s, I visited him at his home when he lived in Pinellas County here. Okay, yes, I went to Inalco, which is the estate where Hitler lived, in 2009, also 2008, then in 2009. I came back with a small group in 2009, and I rented 2 small cabin cruisers to take us to the estate, and we beached the boats on the sandy beach, and then we had to walk about 150 feet across a grassy area. And all of a sudden, I see our boat captain, who was about 60 years old at the time, walking along next to me with his right arm in the air, and he's goose-stepping. And I said, what in the hell are you doing? He says, I know who lived here. And I said, yeah, how do you know that? He said, I was a child. My father was the caretaker, and I lived here. And he said, I know who lived here. And he put his left index finger under his nose like a little mustache, put his right arm in the air, and stepped back to his boat. So I was there twice, and thanks to a short stint with the Mafia in Chicago, I learned how to pick locks, and I let myself in. So we have photos inside the estate. All these are on my website, sharkhunters.com. And you go to previous tours and click on any one of the 4 Argentine trips or the Brazil trip to see bunches of photos of what we've just been talking about. I shot photos of everything and uploaded most of them in there. So another big question, why didn't they go after him? I think you hit it good on the head. The state of Israel, they needed the vote. But also, we needed the scientists. When I was a young punk in the U.S. Air Force, 1958, January until June, I spent 6 months in intensive training for weapons and special weapons. Special weapons means thermonuclear bombs, hydrogen bombs. And part of the training, in the early part of it, we watched movies of the American nuclear weapons development, and the U.S. was having a real struggle. And then all of a sudden, right around the end of the war, according to the movie, our brilliant scientists had a breakthrough. We had rocket airplanes, we had jet airplanes, we had nuclear weapons that we didn't know we had. And as I've learned now lately, 560 kilos of uranium came over on board the submarine U-234, which was a mine-laying submarine converted into a cargo boat. The skipper was Johann Heinrich Fehler, who had been the demolitions officer on board the Raider Atlantis. He was a member of Shark Hunters, and I spent a whole day with him in his home in Hamburg. And the chief radio man was also a member of Shark Hunters. I spent a lot of time speaking with him and several of the other officers. But, of course, to paraphrase, nobody knew nothing. I'd ask Captain Fehler about the uranium, and his answer was, I was not good in chemistry in university, so I know nothing about that. The cargo officer, he said, I didn't know anything about uranium. I just needed to know the weight and the size of the cartons or containers so that I knew how to trim the boat. So some years later, Wolfgang Hirschfeld, the chief radioman, he met up with a fella in Argentina, and they worked together and wrote a book about U-234 and some of the special equipment they had on board. I think it's only available in Spanish right now. So anybody who doesn't, you know, if people had seen everything that I've seen and have tried to put into our book, which is 302 pages, there'd be no doubt in anybody's mind. Hitler got away. We got so many thousands and thousands of scientists. The paperclip, Operation Paperclip, picked up so many. But a lot went to Argentina. Professor Kurt Tank, the guy that developed the Focke-Wulf FW-190 fighter, he went to Argentina, and he brought some 50 of his aeronautical engineers with him, and they were building planes for the Argentine Air Force. And then I just came back 3 weeks ago, and when I was there, I met this delightful old gentleman who was the spokesman of the Argentine Air Force, and he gave me all sorts of goodies to bring home with me, including a DVD. And I was watching the DVD, and it was made in the late 50s, I think. And they had a camera set up, and one by one, the various different Argentine Air Force planes would roll past the camera. And I'm sitting there watching it, this plane, that plane. Some of them looked so ugly they couldn't fly. Others were really sleek. And then all of a sudden, there's a Horton flying wing. And I'm thinking, what the heck? So I emailed back to him, because everybody knows about the Horton jet bomber that was built in Germany. It was the first of the stealth planes. And sure enough, the Horton brothers had also emigrated to Argentina and were building flying wings on an experimental basis down there. They only built a couple of them. But the guys who came over there, and of course down in Bariloche, out on that lake, Lake Nahuahuapi, there's an island called Hoymel Island, and in 1947 they built a nuclear research facility for Dr. Ronald Richter and his staff from Germany. where they were experimenting with nuclear power. And according to Dr. Joe Farrell, in one of his books, they did achieve a very short-lived cold fusion. And then, of course, there's a long story about why that didn't hold up under scrutiny, that Perón shot off his mouth, that they had become a nuclear power and they shouldn't have, et cetera, et cetera. So, and
basically, how long did Hitler live there? How long? When did Hitler die?
Yeah, we believe it was 1962.
About 1962. Okay.
Right.
Now,
Don Angel met with him in 1952.
Okay. Angel had met. Okay, this is the fellow who gave you the original information then.
Yes, sir.
Okay, fine. And now, did Eva stay with him, or did they eventually split up? What happened to Eva? Do we know what happened to Eva?
Last we heard, he died in 1962. They were still together at that point. But one of our members, a friend of mine, a guy named Abel Basti down there, had located a woman named Catalina Gamaro and talked to her on the phone. And, Catalina said that she had waited on Hitler and Eva Braun at the Eden Hotel up in Cordova. And he was going to come see her, and she said she had photographs, etc. And then at the last, before he got going, she contacted him again and said, no, don't come up here because they told me I must not speak with you while the lady is still living. And this was in 2002, so we assumed by that Eva Braun was still living in 2002, which wouldn't be so difficult. She was born in 1912, which would have made her 90-something years old, and that's not unheard of in these days.
So basically Hitler then lived there and throughout the rest of his life and died of old age. And did he spend most of his time there? In other words, he avoided traveling around for fear people would recognize him? That's
exactly right. He, to our research, he did not live the open lifestyle like for instance, Martin Bormann. He was back to Europe several times, and he lived his life kind of openly in the early days after the war because he was best buddies with Juan Perón.
Sure.
And for the Mossad could not come in and get these well-protected guys like Hitler, like Bormann, like Mengele, and all these others. We list them all in our book. They couldn't come in and do a sneak raid like they got Eichmann because nobody was protecting Eichmann. So if they wanted to really come in and get Hitler, it would have required a full-scale military invasion, and that was just out of the question at that time. So, for instance, there was a guy named Ludwig Freude. Freude was a director of the Banco Transatlantico Alemán, the German transatlantic bank, and he was helping funnel the money in from primarily under Bormann to help fund what they called Die Spinne, the spider, otherwise known as Odessa. And after the war was over, the Allies said, hey, we want Ludwig Freude here to stand trial. And Juan Perón more or less said, hey, he's my friend. He ain't going anywhere. So he's buried there. I went through the German cemetery, excuse me, and there's Captain Langsdorff, the guy who committed suicide after he blew up his battleship Graf Spee. But there's also a whole lot of high-ranking Germans. Ludwig Freude, another guy, Karl Wernet, who was a doctor, and he believed that homosexuals could be cured by surgery. He escaped to Argentina, and he had a clinic there where he was experimenting. The list goes on and on, more than you've got airtime, I think. But we have input coming from many directions, including one of our guys we called Agent Rembrandt, because he was with Dutch Secret Service, and we got a lot of files from them also about the guys going to South America. So, and anybody, if anybody sees what we have and still believes Hitler shot himself in the bunker. These are the people that expect a fat guy in a red suit to come down their chimney on Christmas Eve.
Well, I think it's very difficult for people to accept this, but I think once they see all of the evidence that's there, and it's not simply Harry and his group, but there are others that have done similar research, and you come to the similar conclusion, and then you begin to realize, of course, there was been a conscious cover-up by the mass media in America, working in concert with our intelligence agencies to conceal the truth from the American people. We'll be back in just a moment. Well, this is Dr. Stan. Harry, you've got 3 minutes to wrap up this program, but I hope you'll be willing to come on to our other programs. We do a number of different audiences. You know, we do 5 hours of talk radio a day, probably more than anybody else does, and 3 different networks, and so we're trying to get the information out. So all the audiences are very, very different. But what are your parting thoughts before we let you go tonight?
Parting thoughts simply are the fact that the Third Reich did not dissolve at the end of the war. They merely moved south. Our book chronicles this all the way through, and we've got tons of photos and FBI files and charts and some secret charts of hidden harbors down in the Tierra del Fuego area and the explanation. So this is, I don't make any money off this. Any money that comes in on the sale of these books goes to shark hunters. I walked off a very high-paying job as vice president of a company in Chicago to devote my full time to shark hunters, and I don't take a salary. So I have no axe to grind, and everything that's in there is absolute fact. And if anybody can prove that it's not fact, well, God bless them. They're a lot sharper than I am, because we have verified, confirmed, and double verified everything we've put in the book. And as I say, if your listeners will go to sharkhunters.com, they'll see all sorts of interesting things there about the escape, the rat line, and also the U-boat history. And if they send an email to me at sharkhunters@earthlink.net, there's also a way to get that from the front page of our website. Just tell me they'd like a copy of our monthly magazine. We'll send it out at no charge.
Now, is the estate empty now? Who owns the actual estate where Hitler lived? Do we know?
It's been empty for some years. I understand it's owned by a very wealthy attorney in Buenos Aires, and it's up for sale for something like 40 million Yankee dollars, which is a bunch of money. But it's a huge, big, beautiful building. Plus, there are many outbuildings. There are guest houses. There's also a small house where they've channeled a stream underneath, and it turns a paddle wheel to generate their own electricity. They've got another small house just outside, which is where the furnace was, and the hot water was piped into the house. They heated by steam in radiators in those days. And the boathouse is still there. So, and it's got a lot of it land, and it's up the finger of a lake. And to get there by boat, back in the old days, there's a tower. If you're coming,
we're going to have to let you go. We're out of time. Good night. Okay. God bless. Bye-bye.
All right. God bless. Thank you, Doctor.
Well, this is Dr. Stan, and we do hope you enjoyed our interview with Harry Cooper of sharkhunters.com. That's www.sharkhunters.com, and I believe what Harry is telling us is absolutely true. And now, of course, we've interviewed Dr. Jerome Corsi. We have his interviews. We have the interview with Gerard Wilson, or Williams, I should say, who wrote a book, The Grey Wolf. So both Sydney Hunting Hitler and Grey Wolf, these 2 books are available. We will have a 4-CD set very soon that'll have all of this information in it, and we want you to get it. We want you to copy the CD set. We want you to get it out far and wide. And hopefully the people will begin to understand that most of what they think they believe just isn't true, that the media in America is controlled. We carry a wonderful book called The New Media Monopoly. We actually have a 4-CD set, certainly on the media you must understand that they control our reality, they control the educational system, they control the major banks, they control the military, they have their people in the corporations, they have their people certainly working within the educational system, they have the people planted within our religious organizations, and certainly, basically, of course, the Pope has come out recently wanting to join all religions together, even the atheists. He said we all worship the same God. Atheists worship the same God. Oh, yeah, we all worship the same God, and the Buddhists and certainly the Hindu and the Muslim, and we all worship the same God, and even the atheists. We want to get everybody together into this common religion, and that's what the job of the Pope is. But then the Vatican's been infiltrated with the satanic cult for a long time, and if you doubt that, you need to get our 4-CD set. The Wisdom of Malachi Martin. Father Malachi's been dead for a long time, but the Wisdom of Malachi Martin, he talks about the satanic cult at the highest level of the Vatican. And Pope, he was a personal confidant of Pope John Paul XXIII. Fascinating information you're not going to get through other channels. You need to get this information. You need to help us get it out. So remember our telephone number is 1-800-544-8927. 1-800-544-8927. If you're only going to get one item, get my book, Brotherhood of Darkness. Got a wonderful call today from a cardiac surgeon in upstate New York who's just finished reading the book. Called me personally just to thank me for writing it, saying how much he'd learned from the book. But suddenly then, if you want to get additional information, get the 4-CD set on the Wisdom of Malachi Martin. And then, of course, you can get certainly the books of the Grey Wolf and Hunting Hitler. They're both available by calling 1-800-544-8927. Understand that most of what you think you believe just isn't true. And they control the news media. They're laying us up. We're getting ready for a major financial collapse in America. We're getting ready for a major war, and just whether it's going to be a war in the Middle East. Down the line, there's going to be a war with both Russia and China. We're heading towards a world nuclear confrontation. That is why we are unilaterally disarming today. Why do you think we're cutting back certainly our military to the lowest level it's been since the end of the Second World War? Why, in preparation for the coming war, ladies and gentlemen, if we at one time had 31,000 nuclear weapons, today we're down to about 1,500 nuclear weapons, and we're cutting the number, where the Russians and the Chinese are doing everything they can to build nuclear weapons as rapidly as they can so that they will be victorious in the coming war. And you say this is madness, and you're absolutely right. But of course, remember that God does bring a judgment upon nations that turn against Him, and America has turned against God. Our telephone number is 1-800-544-8927. If you're in a position to help Radio Liberty financially, I can tell you we quite frankly need your help and support. And if you'd like to, of course, become a member of the Radio Liberty family, or certainly get the 4-CD sets or get the other material, our number is 1-800-544-8927. Please pray for Radio Liberty.
I've been to Argentina 4 times. Every time, of course, I'd spent a week in Buenos Aires speaking to people. And 2 times I was in Bariloche and visited the estate where Hitler lived. And 2 times I was in Cordova, which is the area he went after 1955, because in 1955, Bariloche had been discovered as a tourist attraction.
Well, this is Dr. Stan, and certainly Harry is saying that basically there were certain things that initially made it appear that the story wasn't true, but of course as the people he had talked to investigated, everything pointed to the fact that it really was true, that Hitler had actually been taken from the bunker and had actually gone to South America. Well, of course, and then of course Harry has been to South America on 4 times actually, and he's been at least on several occasions, to the actual place where Hitler stayed for so many years when he was living in South America, living there in Argentina and Patagonia. But go ahead with the story. You tell it, Harry, because you've lived this, you've investigated, you've been to the areas, you've talked to the people. Do the people there in Patagonia, some of the Spanish people know that Adolf Hitler was living there and escaped to South America?
You bet they did. When I was there first time in 2008, my two Argentine friends and I went to well, first off, you have to understand, San Carlos de Bariloche, little town at the foothills of the Andes. If you were blindfolded and dropped off there, you'd think you were in Bavaria. So we went.
Well, this is Dr. Stan here at Radio Liberty, coming to you from the hills overlooking beautiful and picturesque Monterey Bay, and bringing you the news behind the news, the story behind the story. Hoping to convince you that reality is usually scoffed at and that illusion is usually king. But in the battle for the survival of Christian civilization, it's going to be reality and not illusion or delusion that'll determine what the future will bring. And I need to remind you the views expressed here are not necessarily those of the owners, management, staff, sponsors, or supporters of the station you're listening to. They happen to be my views, and well, for the next hour, they're going to be the views of Harry Cooper, and we're going to be talking about his book on Adolf Hitler. Hi, Harry, how are you tonight?
Very good, sir. Thank you.
Well, I appreciate so much for being with us, and you're with Shark Hunters. Is that the title of your organization?
Yeah, that's correct. We started 31 years ago, and our primary focus was the history of the German U-boats. And back in those days, we thought it was a clever title because submarines are like sharks, and we hunt their history.
All right, fine. Well, of course, the U-boats are important, but they're also very important to the story of the escape of Adolf Hitler and the fact that most Americans have been conditioned to believe that Adolf Hitler died in a bunker in Berlin at the end of the war. But you have a different story, and that's why I want you to come on tonight, tell our listeners the background of the story that you were told by somebody who already came from the Nazi point of view. Will you go ahead and pick up the story? Anyway, the fellow from Naval Intelligence tells you that he didn't die.
Right.
So what do you do at this point?
Well, at that point, I started following the story a little more closely. And he indicated, Don Angel indicated in this 114-page long letter that Gross Admiral Karl Dönitz was in the Führerbunker in late April of 1945, and I thought this would not be possible because I thought Berlin was totally ringed by the Red Army. So I contacted Captain Ali Kramer, Peter Erich Kramer, who was commander of U-333, but at the end of the war he was in command of the security detail around Gross Admiral Dönitz. And he came back to me and said, no, it was not possible for Admiral Dönitz to be in Berlin because it was ringed by the Red Army. So I figured, okay, Don Angel's a liar. And I just put his letter away and went back to, history of the U-boats. And I got a phone call a week later from Captain Kramer. He had consulted his personal diary and indicated that, yes, Grand Admiral Dönitz was in the Führerbunker over the 20th of April, which was Hitler's birthday. And so he obviously had been telling the truth. So we continued to research, and it's only been in the last few years that it's really gotten intense. And since about 2008, we've just peeled back the layers of onion skin here in SA, and finally retired from that. So he was visiting, I think it was 1985, 86, right after I had gotten the letter from Don Angel. And I asked if he had ever heard of a Spanish spy by the name Don Angel Alcazar de Velasco, and he started to chuckle. And I said, what's so funny? He says, yeah, He was a German spy, we know that, but he was just not a very good spy because everybody knew he was a spy. And so I believed what I was taught in school. And so I said, Bob, this guy must be nuts. He sent me a letter and said that he rode a submarine with Martin Bormann down to South America and that he claimed Hitler didn't die in the bunker. I said, everybody knows he committed suicide. And just as calm as if he was asking for another cup of tea, Bob said, no, he didn't. I said, what do you mean, no, he didn't? He said, we knew Hitler didn't die in the bunker. So I said, okay, who's we? And he said, the intel community.
Hold that thought. We'll be back in a moment.
Very well.
Well, Harry, you picked the story up there, and so you're talking to this fellow who's with naval intelligence, and he said the entire naval intelligence community knew Hitler didn't die in the bunker, and you probably just about, you probably found it almost impossible to believe, as I did when I first heard that, because, I mean, after all, our reality is created by the things we read, and if everybody agrees, but then suddenly this idea that maybe Hitler didn't die, and then, of course, as you pick up the story, and we'll go from there.
Okay. It began in 1985. We had a new member by the name of Don Angel Alcazar de Velasco, who was a Spaniard, of course, with a name like that, and he was an intelligence agent throughout the war, working for Germany, and for about 3 months before the end of the war, he was in the bunker itself. And he sent me a letter. It was typewritten, single-spaced, 114 pages long, telling me about this entire incident. And he saw Hitler and Eva Braun forcibly drugged under orders of Martin Bormann and removed from the bunker. Bormann, of course, was the power behind the throne, more or less. Toward the end of the war, he had pretty well usurped power. Goering was a discredited buffoon, and Himmler and those guys were pretty much pushed on the outside. And so Bormann wanted to keep the Reich alive, and he needed a figurehead. And so Don Angel saw Hitler and Eva Braun forcibly drugged and removed from the bunker. And years later, as I say, Shark Hunters began in 1983. We've just had our 31st anniversary, started our 32nd year. And one of our members was a guy named Bob Thew, T-H-E-W, retired United States Navy captain, and he had spent his entire naval career in naval intelligence. And after he retired, he went into the